Thank you very much. I always put my stopwatch on at the beginning. I just thought I would say, listening to the previous panel, talking about the divide between London and the rest of the country, the comedian Stuart Lee has this great line that on the Monday before the referendum, on the Thursday, he got a call from a friend of his who said, "Stu, it's all going to be fine. I'm in a cafe in Stoke Newington and they're all voting Remain." There's something in that. If it's okay with you, I'm going to talk broadly about the extraordinary political picture we're in and then narrow it down to the relationship between the government and your vocation and profession. I've been a political journalist for the BBC and others for many years, covered the fall of Margaret Thatcher, the rise of John Major and his dramatic fall, the Blair and Brown era where an entire psychiatrist conference couldn't make sense of it. Nothing compares with what we're living through at the moment in terms of drama, implications, and its multi-layered complexity. Theresa May is fascinating. Actually, she's quite a dull public figure, but she's in the most extraordinary situation of any prime minister in recent decades. She becomes interesting in spite of herself, which is quite an interesting situation. Even her interviews, which are dull when you read them, become interesting on second reading. She said something interesting to The Spectator just before Christmas. She said, and it's obvious, but think about it. She said, "I didn't expect to be in this situation. I thought the referendum would be won by Remain. I thought if it was lost, David Cameron would stick to his pledge to stay on." So just reflect on that for a moment. She is in the most extraordinary situation of any prime minister and hadn't really prepared for it. She couldn't do because she didn't expect it was going to happen. She is ambitious. She wanted to be leader and prime minister, but she wasn't ready for this context. She had considerable experience. 6 years at the Home Office would be enough to drive any of us crazy. Most Labour Home Secretaries only lasted about 20 minutes before they resigned or were forced out. It was a titanic achievement, but a very narrow one. She had no need to think about economic policy making. George Osborne was doing all of that until she brutally sacked him. She had no need to reflect on the European Union. The Home Office was beyond security matters, more insular and parochial. And then suddenly, after the most bizarre leadership contest in recent decades, which lasted about 10 minutes, she became prime minister. Indeed, what a weird summer that was. A Labour leadership contest lasting 3 months and electing the same leader. The Tory one lasting 10 minutes and electing a new prime minister. And suddenly, she was faced with Brexit. And she has performed so far brilliantly. But I put the emphasis on performance. I don't think she's put a step wrong in terms of projecting Brexit so far. And as the panel suggested, she has given the impression of clarity. But I emphasize again, and you know the importance of all this better than any audience I ever address, an impression is not always the same thing as what's going on behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, she hasn't got a clue what's going to happen because no one has a clue what's going to happen. Her speech last week was a brilliant composition, like a musical symphony put together by Wagner or somebody like that, because it appeared to be melodious and tonally potent, when actually it was a statement of the obvious. Everything she said at that speech had been implied in previous speeches that she had made, but she hadn't stated it overtly. But also, when she triggers Article 50, the whole dynamic moves to the European Union. I'll tell you something interesting on that. I had a coffee with Cameron about this time a year ago. And Cameron had just begun his so-called renegotiation of Britain's membership, not one of his more happy experiences in power. And he had just got back from the Czech Republic. He was in number 10. And he was flying out that evening to Warsaw to speak to Polish leaders about his puny renegotiation. He looked about 75 when I saw him. He was exhausted. Now, Cameron is a reasonably fit young individual, and he was negotiating a relatively straightforward deal. So straightforward, he lost the referendum on it. Theresa May faces a renegotiation 25,000 times more complicated, and she will be flying around the European Union dealing with all these complex individuals. She doesn't even know which individuals she'll be dealing with because elections could well change the key leading figures. She's going through the equivalent of a political hell. But because she's experienced and understands the rhythms of politics, she conveys a steely certainty. And that's the difference with her main opponent. There is no more brilliant, compelling case for the importance of advertising and projection than Jeremy Corbyn. In this very precise sense. Contrary to what the panel have just told you. I've written about this in The Guardian today. I strongly recommend it, actually. I don't usually say that, but most of what I write, I think, is rubbish, but I think it's quite good today. Labour has always been deeply split over Europe, totally incoherent. When we joined the European Union, its front bench was split all over the place, with titans on either side of the debate. And yet it won 2 elections under Harold Wilson, and then he went on to win a referendum on whether we should stay in or not. Wilson covered up the cracks like a political genius, an advertiser of genius. In the mid to late 1990s, when the huge debate in Britain was over whether we should join the single currency, Labour was all over the place. One day Blair wanted to be in the single currency, Brown wanted it out. The next day Brown wanted to be in, Blair wanted out. Blair said he wanted to save the pound, he loved the pound. The next day he said his historic mission was to join the euro. As incoherent as Labour's position now, but because Blair was a political conjurer, he gave the impression of momentum and direction and tormented John Major for his approach to the euro, even though it was exactly the same as Blair's. It's called political magicianship. And that's not an added extra, a bonus if you're lucky enough to have it. It's a precondition of successful leadership. What Labour needs now to survive, and its survival is at threat, is a dissembler. And I don't say that in a pejorative term. If a party is divided over the issue of the day, you have to find a way of bringing it together by authoritative, compelling dissembling. What this lot of amateurs are doing, because they've never had experience at the top of politics, is dissembling unconvincingly. Like a bad advert, you can see the joins. While we're on the big politics, then I'm going to return and focus on May and advertising. Watch Scotland carefully. I think we here again in London, I don't think London is that cocooned actually, but I think Nicola Sturgeon is preparing for a second referendum. There is a fashionable assumption that she isn't, that it's all just to appease her more militant SNP supporters. I do a show at the Edinburgh Festival, and while I was up there in August, I was taken aback. I had a coffee with someone, as we say in politics or journalism, very close to Nicola Sturgeon. And this person said to me, there will be no better chance for independence than Brexit and the collapse of the Scottish Labour Party. And this person posed the question, if not now, when? And they have hired a very distinguished pollster in Edinburgh to do almost hourly tracking on the mood of the Scottish electorate towards independence. And you listen to her response to every twist and turn on this Brexit drama, and it's always framed in terms of putting the implicit case for independence. She's trying to swing the electorate in Scotland towards her view and using Brexit to do it. She won't do it if the polls are against her, but if the polls begin to move, as this pollster I know thinks they will, she's going to hold it. And if she announces she's holding it, she's going to win, because she'll only hold it if she can win. So I think the dramas are going to intensify rather than narrow. May is a dutiful Prime Minister, very different from Cameron, generationally different, product of the 50s. She is also more statist in a very interesting way. She's often putting the case for government, for the state. So much so that I bumped into Ed Miliband the other day, so I thought I'm going to join the Conservative Party. She's a Milibandite. And there is something in this. And that means at times when she reflects on some elements of advertising, she is not worried about the allegation of being a sort of nanny statist interferer. It's very interesting hearing the Culture Secretary talking about the gambling issue. She, Theresa May, is like Gordon Brown, wanting to dominate her entire government. The gambling initiative came from number 10, as you know, not the Culture Department. I was there was a briefing at the Conservative Party conference on looking at advertising in relation to gambling. Number 10 chose it to focus on this at a key moment, the start of their Conservative Party conference. So there is a kind of moralistic dimension to the May approach to politics, hugely influenced by her senior advisor, Nick Timothy. And they are driving this review on advertising and gambling. And in a way, she's different from Cameron, who, although Cameron could get quite moralistic about advertising, was terrified of the label of being nanny state and not liberal, and he was an instinctive, small statist figure. She isn't. But I think in practical terms, they ended up in the same place. You heard from the Culture Secretary this praise for all of you in the context of the economy post-Brexit. And that is ultimately their obsession. I don't know what the outcome of this review on gambling will be in advertising, but I do know that they are just obsessed with doing nothing that will appear to stifle the UK economy in any way at all. And I think in the end, that will determine their attitude towards advertising. In other words, the positive words you heard earlier this morning is pretty close to the number 10 view, with that qualification that she is quite happy to be our nanny and not regard it as a criticism, but almost as a compliment, to intervene at certain points. But it's number 10 that is the key office deciding all these things. It's great to have this engagement that you have with the Department of Culture, and it's obviously absolutely pivotal. But as with Gordon Brown, everything starts and ends in number 10. However, that is their theoretical intention in this glorious honeymoon they're having at the moment. Miles ahead in the polls, the opposition nowhere to be seen. But they won't be able to keep it up. In other words, the Culture Department will become autonomous quite quickly, not because Theresa May wants it to be, she doesn't. But she is going to be on the road, in Warsaw, in the Czech Republic, back to see Merkel if Merkel's still there. She is not going to have the time to micromanage the culture department, the business department, or indeed much in relation to all your immediate concerns. Brexit is going to suck her up. Europe has brought down the last 3 Tory prime ministers, Thatcher, Major and Cameron. We have no idea whether it will do the same for Theresa May. We know for certain it's going to be the utterly dominant issue of her premiership. Thank you very much for listening. And now,